please move now to page 14, where we have the Old Testament social justice model. There's been a number of Christian authors who have dealt with this particular topic, and the one that is most outstanding and most challenging is the book by S. Ringma entitled Jesus' Liberation and the Biblical Jubilee, and I will in a moment mention why that particular book is so important. So what you have there, and those of you who've done OT, you're all familiar with what's here. Yahweh, as we mentioned before, gives equal distribution to the tribal groupings of the Israeli community and their respective families. But God is able to look further down the line of history and can see that for some people, things are going to go wrong. Things are not going to work out. Whether through negligence or whether through disaster or whatever, there are going to be Israelites who are not going to retain their particular property, are not going to be able to be self-sustaining in some sort of way, and what's going to happen is that they're going to fall into a situation in life where they need care from the broader Israeli community. So this then is a call on the part of the broader Israelite community to exercise compassion towards those in their midst who get into difficulty. Can I just say that that is a blessing for them? It's a blessing for those who have to learn how to give. It makes you a better person. It makes you a better community. So just think of the difference. Just imagine if we are all completely self-sufficient. I don't need you, you don't need me, you don't need anybody in this room, you don't need anybody at all. You are completely self-sufficient. Think about what that does in terms of shaping you in a particular kind of person. And then think by way of contrast that what happens is that in life circumstances, people are going to fall into difficulty. In fact, you may fall into difficulty. And what's going to happen is that people are going to reach out towards you, either spiritually or in counseling or financially or in other forms of support or whatever. Is that going to do something to you? Yes. It's going to fill your heart with gratitude, the ability to receive. That's a wonderful thing. If we learn how to receive, that is a great, wonderful thing already in terms of our self-development. And if we then also learn how to give, to go out of our way in terms of helping the other person, that also actually enriches us. So in other words, there is a profound spirituality implicit in this particular model that we have in front of us. So what the Old Testament legislation then calls us to do is practice the year of Jubilee. So equalize land ownership after 50 years. The sabbatical year, which is the 7th year in terms of land being left fallow and slaves to be set free. And we read the passage in Deuteronomy 15. There's the law of tithing. there's no interest to be charged to the poor, and there's the law of gleaning. So what scholars have pointed out to us is that this is really a model that we call a structural justice model, as opposed to the practice of charity. Now, what's the difference between the two? So let me explain. Charity is an act of human kindness that you do in a particular situation, and it's simply up to you. Persons in need, all around us, living in Manila, we see needy people, people beg, etc., etc. We're all aware of people who are poor, and an act of charity is a personal response that you and I are willing to make in a particular situation. And basically, that comes out of a heart of goodness that has been shaped by the gospel. But structural justice is something that God commands us always to do, and is not simply a personal response, it's a communal response, and it's a command, it's an instruction. Or if you like, it's an infrastructure within the Israelite community. So this then moves from the personal only to the corporate and the institutional. And of course, most societies in the modern world have actually been shaped by this thinking without ever referring to it, because it's pretty uncool in terms of our modern political structures to refer to the Old Testament. But when you, for example, have a welfare system, so people, for example, in our country, if people are unemployed or they have a disability or whatever the case may be, there is automatically within the Australian governmental welfare system an opportunity for people in those circumstances to get help, to help them over a difficult time so that they can get back on their feet. And this really comes directly from the Old Testament. So here's my suggestion. What about our churches? What about giving in our churches? So when you give, is the giving simply for church-related issues? Or is giving also for others, the outsider, the vulnerable, and so forth and so on? So in the long history of Christianity, there has always been two kinds of giving. And that's why historically in churches, we've had two kinds of collections. The one collection has been for church-related activities. And the second collection, which was in terms of the diaconate for the deacons, was giving in relation to the poor, not within the church community, but those with whom the church had contact. So think about the way in which we practice that or fail to practice that as a reflection in terms of what's spoken about here. And what we really need to do always is when we read both OT and NT, we have to ask the question, how can we bring the heart of what's being spoken about here into our daily lives and into our situations? So I know, and Mam Zenit, are you open to saying something at this point, that there are Christian businesses who very deliberately draw from this particular model and build into their business operations the capacity to give goods away or services away to needy people as a way of expressing a contemporary expression of what we're talking about here in terms of the Old Testament social justice model. So, Mam Zenit, would you like to come here and just share one story? So, you realize it's very dangerous to come into the class here, don't you?
To pay my,
you have to pay. You have to earn your keep.
earn my keep.
Yes.
Well, I think one good model is the social enterprise, because a social enterprise, more than business for mission or business mission, really looks at solutions to a societal problem. And so one very good example that I study is locally we have human nature. Human nature is a social enterprise that was started by the sister Anna and her sister. They're daughters of Meloto, who's the founder of Keimpe. And so growing up, these two these sisters were exposed to helping the poor, community transformation, but they're graduates of Ateneo, and so they have this entrepreneurial spirit, and they started a social enterprise which is pro-Filipino, pro-poor, and pro-environment, and their products are world-class. They're into personal care, body care products, and I'm a personal user of that. What they do is help farmers grow raw materials for their products, such as lemongrass and others. They not only help farmers, but they actually grant them financial assistance and technical assistance, and they get, of course, good ready market for their produce. So that's one. And I know for a fact that even the employees within the Human Nature company are paid more than minimum wage, like the warehousemen who are former street dwellers. But the company has an intentional program to teach them financial management, so that these people who originally came from the streets now have their own homes, or renting their own homes, or paying for their own homes, and they're able to save up. So this is, I think, a very good model of a Filipino enterprise that helps solve poverty in the Philippines, as well as being environmentally correct.
Wonderful.
That's just one.
Thank you.
Just one.
Wow. Thank you, Mam Zenit. And I know you have many, many more stories, right? Many other examples of this. So there's something really, really wonderful here, because what it demonstrates is the relevance of Scripture, and the relevance of studying Scripture, and then wrestling with how we can bring that into the 21st century in the respective situations where we find ourselves. In that sense then, the Bible then becomes more and more a living book for us. God speaks to us. We then wrestle with understanding Scripture, and then we further wrestle with how to apply it into our lives and into our situations. So, very important model in relation to transformation theology. And maybe some of you who are OT persons may want to think about writing an exegetical paper of some sort in relation to this particular biblical paradigm for transformation theology. So we're still on page 14. Let's now just have a look at the prophetic movement and the kings of Israel. The first thing that we need to realize is that there was initial conflict and difficulty with regard to the Israelites wanting a king like other nations. And we had a reading last week from 1 Samuel 8, and you remember that Samuel warned the Israelites, if you want a king, well, this is what's going to happen. However, we need to be very aware of the fact that even though there is this initial ambivalence, and there are these warnings about kingship, that God supports kingship, and there is of course all sorts of prophecies about the power and the significance of Davidic kingship. So the first thing that I want to draw from that is that that God is pro-structures and God is pro-government. So don't ever think that God is anti-institutions and that God is anti-government. That's a complete misunderstanding of the main thrust of Scripture, and it's a misunderstanding in terms of what we need to talk about here. So one of the things then that we see when we read the Old Testament in particular, that God has a great hope for the kingship. And what God is hoping for is that the kings will be God's royal rule over Israel. And that they are to be the stewards of God's royal power. So what we have at play here is the concept that Yahweh is willing to delegate his power and his responsibility to a particular form of governance, namely the Israelite kings. So that's very positive, no? That's an absolute positive understanding of the way in which God is committed to structure and to institution and to governance. Moreover, when you read the OT carefully, you will discover that the kings were to be the wise shepherds of Israel, to protect her from her enemies and to be the promoters of justice. So the kings were given a very, very important set of responsibilities with regard to their role in the Israeli community. But of course, what happened, as we have all read in the Old Testament, is that there were good kings and there were not so good kings and there were terrible kings. So it's a very, very mixed picture with regard to how particular kings assumed or failed to assume their God-given responsibility. So that then should be, I think, a very important signal for us if we want to bring that into our contemporary society. So we can say this: God is committed to institution and to governance. But of course, those institutions and that governance has to be according to God's overall will and purpose. And what's very, very clear is that the kings need to be responsible for protection and justice. And in a similar way, that needs to be true in terms of contemporary governments in our world. Just as the kings, not all, but some, went astray, so governments in history have also gone astray. And very clearly, some much more than others. And yes, we're back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer again. Or if you like, we can divert from Bonhoeffer, get away from Germany for once, and we can go to Russia under Stalin. Possibly some around about 24 million Russians were killed in terms of the purges at that time. And we can also go to China in terms of Mao Zedong. So there's lots of contemporary examples with regard to what has happened within your lifetime. Or maybe not quite some of you, but certainly within my lifetime, where governments have really gone seriously astray. And we already see that within the Old Testament. So therefore we should not be surprised that that is something that can happen. So in Samuel 8, we see the problem of class elitism and cronyism. Because in 1 Samuel 8, cronyism is directly spoken about. The king is going to get this, the king is going to take that, and what is he going to do? He's going to pass it on to his cronies. Now, if the king is going to pass things on to his cronies, what does that mean? He's going to take more. That's what it means. He's going to take a lot. And as a consequence, the people may be feeling hardship and so on. So what we have then here is the issue of the possibility that legitimate power can become corrupted. And that partly was what my lecture was about Thursday night. Yes. Last night, wasn't it? Yes, that happened last night. Man, when I got home, did I fall asleep? I'm glad I managed to get into bed before I fell asleep. Okay, so the problem then of the corruption of power. So the history of kings then is characterized by intrigue, unfaithfulness, corruption, and idolatry. Now what we then have, and this is absolutely fascinating, and I really want you to think about that, is that God sets up a counter voice. Remember, I have emphasized in this class the importance of the Trinity. God doesn't work in terms of singularities. God works in terms of pluralities. Jesus did his ministry in the power of the Spirit. And he was doing what the Father wanted him to do. Jesus gathers a discipleship community. And within the OT, we have the role of the king, we have the role of the priest. Kings and priests colluded primarily. They're on the same page. They reinforced each other. But the role of the prophets was an other voice and a corrective voice within the life of Israel. So what you have here then is the idea that God is willing to work in multiple ways not simply through a singular authority structure. And therefore, by way of implication, we can say this, that when a governmental structure is erring in particular ways, God would want to stir up the church for the church to raise its voice, to play a prophetic role. That's totally consistent with the idea that God's on about multiple structures, including a corrective structure that we see with regard to the role of the prophets. So let's stop being nervous about this. If you look at the big history of Christianity, the church has never tried to replace the government. And the church has never tried, first and foremost, to pull a government down. The role of the church has always primarily been a voice of correction, calling the government to its proper responsibility. That even happened in terms of Germany under Hitler. The first move of Karl Barth, Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, together with the confessing church, was to sign the Barmen Declaration, B-A-R-M-E-N. Google it. It's very short. It's only one page. And what it's basically saying is that the state can never ever assume a totalistic responsibility, because even the state has to respond to what God has revealed in Scripture, and therefore the church has the right, who are the bearers of Scripture and the bearers of revelation, to raise their voice to tell the state what it should be doing in terms of justice issues. Not how to run the economy, not how to run the parliament, not how to run the Congress. That's not the responsibility of the church. But the church has to raise the voice in terms of justice issues. So this is then what we learn from the OT of all places. Hello. So let's be OT scholars. Okay, so let's have a look then on top of page 15. So the role of the prophets then is first of all to be God's voice to the nation and specifically to the king. So often the prophets speak directly to the ruler of that time, to the intelligentsia and the cronies as well. Secondly, and those of you who've done the prophetic tradition, isn't it amazing how often the Israeli prophets also prophesy in relation to the surrounding nations? So these Israeli prophets had an international perspective. They were the first on about globalization, long before globalization became a key word for us in the contemporary society. They had a global perspective. And why did the prophets of Israel have a global perspective in relation to the surrounding nations? The reason is because they were big picture thinkers and thought through the following basic issue. Let me illustrate in terms of something in relation to ministry here in the Philippines. If you are an urban poor community worker So that's where you're grounded. That's your workspace, that's your ministry space, and so forth and so on. You're on the ground, right? Do you have to think about wages issues? Do you have to think about Philippine economy in the global economy as that impacts urban poor workers? The answer is yes. You do have to think about those things. You have to be a big picture thinker when you work specifically. So you know the famous saying, don't you? Think globally, act locally. That's the wisdom. And that was already characterized by the wisdom of the prophets. Act locally, think globally. Because we're living in an interconnected world, and that was also true at that time. So the prophets then were God's voice for morality. They were God's voice for social justice. And they were spokesmen on behalf of the poor. And the prophetic analysis with regard to exploitation involved three important areas. And this comes through again and again when you read the prophets. So first of all, what happened was that property was illegally seized by those in power. Hello? So, our helper, when we were living here, whose father owned a small property that the mayor wanted and he refused to sell. The mayor then colluded with the police to bring false charges against our helper's father, and he was put in prison. And when he was put in prison, the mayor took the property. Hello? This happens. So seizure of property is something that occurs again and again in the prophetic material. The second are traders who exploit. So that has to do with false weights and measures, which occurs again and again. Now, I can tell you multiple stories with regard to how that occurs in the majority world. So what happens is this, that a person is a farmer. So let's say growing bananas. And a person is a middleman who buys from the farmer his bananas. And so not only are weights manipulated, but prices are also manipulated. So the middle person will simply say to the farmer, which is not true, I have already bought so many bananas. I already have too many bananas. I'm willing to take your bananas this time at half price. So what's the single farmer going to do in terms of the middleman who makes him that offer? He thinks, my bananas will rot if this person's not going to buy them. So the person then is put on the spot and then will sell the bananas for half price. And that's the reason why in the majority world farmers formed cooperatives. And when farmers began to form cooperatives in El Salvador, the word was put out that these farmers had become communists because they had formed cooperatives and collectives, because what happens is, as a collective, in terms of having many farmers who have grouped together, they have some power as opposed to a single farmer who has little power or no power at all. So the weirdest thing in the world is that whenever poor farmers have begun to organise themselves to resist being exploited by traders and middlemen and so forth and so on, they've always been accused of being communist, which is simply not true. But of course, if you're a communist, then you're half dead already. Even though, yeah, you're dead man walking in many situations. Now the third, and this is also relevant and important, the prophets then refer to corrupt judges. So, when your property has been seized and you've been ripped off by the middleman, the only recourse that you have is to go to the judge. And if the judge is also corrupt, who then do you turn to? And the only place that people like this can turn to is to cry out to Yahweh. And that's then where you have the Psalms of Lament. And part of the Psalms of Lament include, Yahweh, where are you? Lord, why do you let the rich prosper and you are not there for us? That's in the Psalms. And that reflects a very, very deep reality in terms of the things that we're talking about here. Now, therefore, I want you to get hold of this basic idea. It's what we call compounded injustice. So those three, can you see how the one compounds the other? Just as much as we talk about compounded poverty, so we need to talk about compounded injustice. Loss of property, false weights and measures, and then the issue of corrupt judges. Can you now understand the point that I made only very, very briefly, I think, in the first couple of lectures, which almost feel like that we had those about 6 months ago? Doesn't that feel like ages ago when we first got together? My goodness, and it's only been a couple of weeks. But the point that I made there, and it may not registered fully with you, so let me say it again. The Bible is written from the underside of history. The Bible is concerned not first and foremost with Pharaoh, but first and foremost with the oppressed Israelis who experience liberation. And when you read the Pentateuch, and you read the prophetic tradition, and you read the Gospels, then what strikes you again and again is that God is on the side of those who are the weakest in a society, but God is also on the side of those who are rich and powerful, providing they are converted. And of course, the poor also need to be converted. So conversion is a call to all of us. The poor have the extra call to be open to receive, and the rich have the extra call to be willing to give. So there's a sort of a very interesting dynamic that operates there. And then finally, in just concluding this about the prophets, is that the prophets were not only concerned with the here and the now. They were also persons who looked down the corridors of time and saw a new future, a new messianic future, where every person would sit under their fig tree, where every person would receive the value of the work of their hands. In Isaiah in particular, this vision of a community that is at peace and there is human flourishing. So let me then make this simple application. If you are working for social change, by implication, you have to be a visionary. Because if you're working for social change, you're working for something that is not yet, but needs to come into being. And unless you are a totally destructive person, what you are hoping to do is to see something better come into being. And in that sense, you are also a visionary of something that is good and beautiful and more whole and more just, and that coming into being.